Namaste, dear friends and listeners. It is Sunday, April 26, 1:05 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and this is the Almost Daily Zencast. Fear is a liar, friends. Fear is a liar. Do not let fear in. Now, how does that work? What does one do? How do you, or I, or anybody, prevent fear from working its way into our hearts? We have to stay strong. We are a species quite accustomed to fear. We are a species that some might argue is addicted to fear. Sounds outrageous, right? But then what is a roller coaster but a fear-generating machine that is exciting to engage with, right? What are action-adventure movies but situations where we can simulate fearful events and survive them like badasses, right? Through the association and the projection onto of our own selves into the characters on the screen. What are some of our more extreme sports all about? But adrenaline. What is adrenaline? The byproduct of fear. Thrill rides, thrill seekers. We are a species obsessed with running towards death and then avoiding it as hard as possible. And we have created for ourselves, for there is no one else to blame but all of us as a species, as a collective. If we want to take responsibility, never mind that. If we want, I started with the second half of the formulation. If we want to make real, serious change in the world, we have to, as a collective, as a species, as a community of various communities, have to take an aggregate responsibility. We have to step up and go, this is all of our faults. We may not have invented the system that we inherited, but so far, we've only empowered it, most of us. Yes, of course, there are many of us, many of you out there speaking out against it. I have been speaking out against it, and yet here I am, right? I'm no Greta Thunberg, or whatever her name is. I can never quite figure out how I'm supposed to pronounce that. I'm no radical street protester throwing rocks at the evil, oppressive police state. I'm an abstainer, right? I'm a conscientious objectioner of the entire mess because it's a distraction. It's a treadmill of distraction. It is a giant hamster wheel of keeping us busy doing everything but what we're supposed to be doing. And it was not imposed on us by anyone else other than ourselves. You can point fingers and say, but it's the Illuminati, or the Zionist Jews, or the super rich people, or the deep hidden ones, or the lizard aliens here for the gold, or you can point fingers all you want. But one of the most profound truths that anyone and everyone can rediscover for themselves is that life is indeed a unity. We have this individualized experience in these bipedal, ambulatory, talking, walking, emoting meat sacks of bone and blood and muscle. But these individuated experiences are not the end-all, be-all of the phenomenological event, the true, total workings of what's going on. And when one digs deep enough, one comes to a point, a singularity, a moment of understanding that the following, once perceived directly, is really hard to deny. And that's that consciousness is consciousness is consciousness. There is no ambiguation. There is no individuation. Those are all illusions resulting from the way in which we've designed the mechanics of the material realm. But that gets, into layers of discussion that are difficult to jump to if we're focused on purely the material, which is what's wrong with the world, right? We are, as a species, addicted to the limitations of the things that we can do purely in the material realm, to the extent that we have convinced ourselves to neglect and ignore and indeed almost vilify that which could be considered beyond the material realm. So much going on in the world, and there's so much suffering, there's so much pain from even before this current emergency phenomena, this emergency status that we're all enduring. There has been a deep-rooted spiritual trauma. And I know, broken record, right? I talk about this every other episode. But in part because I want to make sure that I'm never misunderstood, right? I'm not here arguing for that political party's solution or this political party's solution. I don't bring you my ideas on the airwaves in order to convince you to follow me. I speak out because it is my humble opinion. After being stuck here on this planet for 44 years, it is my humble opinion, based on that span of time, observing people, observing the way in which historical events come to fruition, without trying to judge, right? I observe without judgment. I'm not here to point fingers. I like to lay criticisms where I think criticisms are fairly and responsibly meant to be laid, right? But I also am not here to say this person, that political party, that political party are absolutely evil and wrong and totally at fault for everything and must be destroyed. Mind you, that's what everyone is encouraged to do, isn't it? More important, I think, this may sound crazy to people, more important than the current controversial reaction to this thing that is being described as a novel coronavirus. Independent of that, I humbly believe that as a species, through the confluence of historical events that not any one of us individually could have controlled, no individual, no matter how powerful or wealthy, could have controlled 100% in totality the confluence of events that have brought us to this given moment. That's not physically possible. The real life, mundane boundaries and limitations of reality as we know it in the material dimension make that claim impossible. So there is no one individual we can blame. In fact, the nature of historical unfolding, if we can call that a thing, the nature of the way in which reality presents itself to us as individuals and as a collective, means that I think, based on my own assessments, that the more powerful the more powerful position is that of like a collective understanding. In other words, individual points of power or knowledge or control, they can get pretty powerful, but they cannot become absolute. It's not physically capable. They are not physically capable of exercising absolute control over the world and its unfolding events. I think. I could be wrong. Plenty of people out there kind of believe that a very small group of people have absolute control over everything. Am I wrong? I might be. But nature presents a lot of evidence in my favor. Very little in nature is absolute. If you eliminate the ideological constructs from your mind and you look at nature and observe it as unbiasedly as you can, and you observe humanity and that ephemeral quicksilver thing we call human nature, and constantly rationally attribute a bunch of things, problems and or virtues to, and we just observe it instead of try to perpetuate a rationale for some previously described model of it. Right? Is that distinction clear? Like, we need to observe the world, the universe, ourselves, one another, each other, and the collective whole species. We need to observe with clarity, not argue about which previously defined ideological model of what should be going on or what might be going on or what could be going on is most righteous. Those are two completely different paths. And if we want to solve all of the problems, including this pandemic thing, if you want to solve all of the problems that existed before the pandemic so that we don't just return with some sort of complacent sense of gratitude that we're no longer at the heightened pandemic level of stress loads and that somehow that makes the previous normal okay. Because I tell you, friends, that would be a huge mistake for us to make as individuals, as communities, as states, as nations, and as a global collective. That would be a huge mistake. I could be wrong, but I asked you to consider it, right? Like, I ask you all to join me in considering. And so the question tends to become, all right, okay, we'll try that. How do we start? Where to begin? What do we do? First, we need to lay down, in my humble opinion, all argumentation. And that's hard, right? It's so seductive. Someone makes a statement, you disagree with that statement, you are compelled almost by some sensation of inner motivation to make a statement that either adjusts, clarifies, argues against, denies, attempts to debunk. We are confrontational. And some would argue that that is, quote, just human nature. I've always, just like the phrase common sense, I have always doubted and been, what's the word I'm looking for? Suspicious. Just not quite, like common sense and this other thing. What's the phrase I just used? Regardless, I've always been a bit like hesitant to just be like, yeah, okay, cool. Oh yeah, human nature. A lot of things get attributed to common sense. A lot of things get called, well, that's just human nature. And I really have often doubted and questioned and wondered, like, is that a valid thing to do? Is endless war profiteering really just part of human nature? Is racism really just an unavoidable aspect of human nature? Is that common sense? Is that what common sense is? Is that where common sense leads us to to put our conclusions at, I've never been fully able to agree with those kinds of rationalizations. In large part because as an observer, I don't see any form of consistent evidence for that in nature, absent the ideological impact of ideological constructs that human beings develop, define, share, preserve, and cling to in an attempt to perpetuate. It's ideological constructs that drive us towards war profiteering. Once we buy into an ideological construct about economy and about the value of profit being greater than the value of other things, like life itself, and then we become addicts of war profiteering. So we come back to this thing about fear. We are in an interesting catch-22. I mean, we've always lived with fear, right? We used to fear the elements, literally. Lightning and storms were life-threatening events. We fucking mock them now and consider them mild inconveniences to our preferences or previously established expectations. We are having this argument about climate change and about climate disasters becoming imminent. But as a collective, as a whole, the human species seems to have intellectually, not necessarily physically, but intellectually out-evolved the rational fear of our elements. And thus, we have neglected the natural world and pushed it to this new place of extremes. Fear is an exceptionally clever manipulator. It's, I would argue, being an esoteric, mystic of no school, being a self-taught, autodidactic, entheogenic, cannabinoid mystic without an ideological construct, without a school of thought conditioning me, I'm just cobbling together my own thesis, right? It might be flawed, it might be riddled with lots of holes, but at least I am certain that it has not been spoon-fed to me. I just want to make that clear. I don't think I'm towing anyone else's line, other than, through inclusion, towing multiple lines that don't necessarily all go together, because I'm trying to weave something new into existence, if that makes sense. Maybe it's not that new either, but I'm trying to make something here. And that's this. A theory that is approachable enough so that people who are caught up in an addiction of fear, an addiction of ideological righteousness, an addiction of whatever, because we are very addicted species. We're addicted to some crazy shit too, not just talking about drugs, right? We forget that ideas alone, words themselves, can trigger physiological, bioelectrical responses in the human mechanism. Fear is one of those things. Now, a materialist might minimize fear down to a petty emotion. But even at that level, it works as an addictive force, the way the craving for a cigarette, which is in and of itself, when you put it down on paper and you minimize it to just a sort of material nothingness, it's just an ephemeral emotional vibe that some person is experiencing, you can dismiss it and say, fuck you, you're just not being strong enough or whatever. But there's honestly evidence for it all reaching to a deeper place, especially when we come to the more complex addictions, the ones that don't have a material vessel, right? We can talk about material addictions, like addictions to alcohol, tobacco, coffee, We have an addiction to unhealthy food product that is not actually nutritious food. We have an addiction to politics, though, which is not a material vessel, right? It's an addiction to a sociological paradigm and procedural set of shared or combated against contested norms or ideological constructs. We are addicted to endless war profiteering. As a society, as a species, whether we believe in it or not, the collective is bound up in this massive addiction. Even those of us who are speaking out against it aren't really free of that, because so much of what we take for granted and or rely on in the world is tainted by it. Fear is a liar, though, right? And we're addicted to fear. Fear makes us into liars, and that's the worst part, friends. And we are living right now under conditions which, whether it's a pandemic or whether it's a mastermind, wicked planned thing, or it's just the result of enough incompetence that has riddled our political system, we are now under extremely high pressure, mundane circumstances, like the very minute to minute movement of our daily lives, as mundane as it might be, just sitting around complying with the social distancing orders, is burdened with an existential threat level of stress. Fear is one of those things that I propose to you for your consideration, much like ego, that is not just a limited physiological emotional response to our circumstances. That it is indeed like, the thing we call ego in the spiritual sense, a form of consciousness, an entity unto itself that has, in some way or another, not necessarily 100% equivalent or akin to our own, but perhaps in an even broader, more further reaching, more profoundly wordless way, it has its own focal point of consciousness somewhere in the metastructural energetic dimensions. And much like ego, it is a consciousness vessel, an energy-based or energy-being consciousness vessel that is striving, along with the collaborative efforts of all other energy beings like that you could consider part of Team Darkness, for lack of a better term, they're striving to create the kinds of impacts on the human species that they are conditioned to create. Fear is conditioned as a supernatural entity to favor the creation and sustaining of fear as an emotional response in human beings. It wants to achieve a sustained and ongoing vibrational result. It's easy to be preoccupied by the kinds of seductive fear traps that fear will set out for us, because some of them, quite ingeniously, actually make us feel self-righteous, indulgent, a sense of supremacy. That's because fear is an extension of ego, right? And ego's most seductive, most efficient, most powerful tool in the human mind is us versus them self-righteousness. I'm better than you. I'm better than all of you. I'm better than everyone. That will drive people to do astounding things. Just like the embodiment of the darkness that we call Satan, one of the most magical or bizarrely successful things about these dark, toroidal, fractal geometric energy consciousness beings that I like to call the Team Darkness, they operate in juxtaposition to Team Light, right? They are subtle, savvy, and sophisticated. And they are playing a game that they understand better than we do, no matter what amount of investigation into that subject matter we may have indulged in, because words have their limitations. But ultimately, I do know one thing that transcends all the problems that they create. And that's where we should turn our focus as humans, because it's the one thing that Team Darkness is proud of itself for successfully distracting us from. And that, my friends, forgive me for sounding like a broken record, is spiritual healing. Just like physical healing in the mundane physical realm, spiritual healing is something that miraculously requires us to trust in the universe and to provide the fertile soil necessary for growth. In other words, as an analogous symbol, or as a sort of allegorical explanation, I'm not sure if I'm using those words. Those weren't the right words, but the following is not literal, but it also sort of is. It requires effort. Our own individual spiritual healing requires us to put in effort. That effort is unquantifiable, though. I can't give you a handy-dandy list of check these 5 boxes off and you're healed, motherfucker. Now, that's $500, please. Right? Like, I can't actually do that. You have to go within yourself. You have to follow the divine guidance. Be still and know I am. That's a really profound bit of guidance that has deep, layered significance and meaning. Fear is really great at preventing you, preventing me, preventing us all from achieving that stillness, from even wanting to make the effort to try to achieve that stillness. Fear is great at heading us off at the pass, right? Fear is great at trimming that movement in the bud. Fear is great at making us doubt what is possible before we even try. Fear is great at convincing us that, you know what, it's probably better to just kick this shit to the side and just not even go there, not even attempt it. It must be flawed. It must be wrong. It must not be right. It must not be good enough. It will not render results that are worthy. Therefore, I won't even try. And it's really great at doing that. I think in our postmodern context, fear has adapted and evolved. Fear has figured out how to instill and inspire and motivate us without us realizing that it's fear. In other words, we can choose things out of fear and then tell ourselves and each other with a straight face and say, but I didn't do that out of fear. I don't feel any fear right now. But if what we're doing is throwing away divine opportunity, if what we're doing is throwing away our own best interests, if what we're doing is throwing out the baby with the bathwater, as the saying goes, why are we doing it? And if we're not acting out of fear, why don't we understand and or register and or see that we're doing that? I propose to you, my friends, that fear has become such a sophisticated liar that he has convinced us that it is not fear. Right? That it is something else. Self-preservation. I mean, I think that's always been one of its powerful tools, right? Because back in the day, when we feared the apex predators of the natural world, when we feared the lions and tigers and bears, oh my, when we feared the uncontrollable whims of Mother Nature's bad climate, which could threaten our lives and our well-being, that fear was helpful. That fear was facilitating us in our survival. And thus, fear knows how to cozy up right into our hearts and talk us into things without it feeling like we're being fearful. Because it's evolved. It's had a really long time and a lot of help from ego and the darkness itself. And right now, in this almost unprecedented time of political hysteria, I mean, there's been other situations that are similar but different, right? Let's not get caught up in that. Let's just go ahead and use the word unprecedented, even though it's burned the fuck out. During these unprecedented times, during this moment of peak stress that is sort of new, different, unusual, not quite the same normal, everyday kind of stress that we're used to, I think fear is being the most seductive it's ever been. I think fear is seducing us, or trying to, right? In a way that we're not ready for, or maybe weren't anticipating. But fundamentally, I am of the bold opinion that fear is not actually out to destroy us, but rather to challenge us to live up to our fullest, most profoundly divine selves. That ultimately all of this is not some horrific hell that we're being punished or something by some malicious or judgmental or rage-filled God, but rather just a natural expression of, to some sort of exaggerated degree, of the very fundamental pop quiz challenge, the moral test or calling that we are born into this material realm to contend with. Do we transcend all of the seductions of teen darkness? Do we learn to identify everything that the darkness is trying to fool us with so that we can heal them, heal it, heal that side of the spectrum, heal the division between the light and the dark? Or do we fall for the same ego traps, the same fear traps, the same greed traps, the same lust traps? Do we fall for the same traps over and over and over again and turn each other into victims? Because, let us be clear, the darkness works through us. All of us. Not just the bad guys that we like to point our fingers to and think horrible thoughts about. That, my friends, is a really naive position to hold. If you think the problem is only over there, with whatever chosen them that you've chosen as the bad guys, that you've identified as those responsible for all the things that are wrong with the world, you're falling for a trap. Because the real way in which the universe works, none of those things are separate. They all exist within us each. Inside each of us is a little devil and a little angel in a wrestling match. Inside each of us is a white wolf and a black wolf, and we need to choose which one we feed the most. Or better yet, because I think that dichotomous version of that story still perpetuates the conflict. There's a white wolf and a black wolf, and as the original saying goes, it ends with the question, which one will you feed? Right? I've contemplated that since the first day I ever came across it. The obvious, seemingly correct answer is feed the white wolf and let the black wolf starve. But both of them are your children. Or worse yet, both of them are you. Both of them are your progenitors. They are your parents. They are your children. They are you yourself. Within each of us, there is a yin and a yang. There is a Satan and a divine God. There is a black wolf and a white wolf. There is a monster and an angel. There is whatever you want and a whatever you want. And the real calling, the real test, could be wrong here, folks, but what I'm doing is asking everyone to contemplate and inviting everyone to just give it a thorough scientific verification. I think the real calling, my friends, is not to choose one or the other, but rather to choose to heal both, to reintegrate that which has been ripped apart. And thus, friends, as we sit in deep frustration and we struggle, whether we're struggling with our inner demons in a place of comfort or we're struggling with the material limitations of this unjust and toxic system out there on the bottom rungs, wherever you are, as you sit through this, consider that the choice is not about winning. The choice is about achieving healing. The test, the calling, the challenge here, it's not about becoming number one. So let us stop trying to do that. The game we're playing here in this place is not about winning. So let's stop trying to do that. Everyone loves to wax philosophical about what the point of life is. The point of life is not to do any of the things that we're doing. The point of life has absolutely nothing to do with commodifying nature into profit. The point of life, the meaning of life, has absolutely nothing to do with judging each other over political ideology. The meaning of life has absolutely nothing to do with brainwashing each other into believing in this religious system, but not the rest. The meaning of life has absolutely nothing to do with any of those confrontational, profit-driven, fear-based, ego-riddled paradigms. The meaning of life has everything to do with growth and healing and transformation and evolution. And thus, friends, right now, again, I remind, I keep saying this just in case anybody out there hasn't heard it yet, and as to continue to connect with those who have already heard this before. We are in unprecedented times, and it's stressful, and it's painful, and it's unjust, and it's hurting and killing people in many different ways. But no matter where we are, each one of us is being presented with an opportunity, a divine opportunity. And that is to see past our own limitations. For whether it's good limitations or bad limitations, to see past them. Not to abandon them in a painful, toxic way, but to see past them in a healing and discerning way. To see past our ideological constructs and be able to put them down, not in a I beat you so you have to give up kind of way. My ideological construct is better than yours, so throw yours away. No. We must all learn to heal and relax and gently let go of our addictions, right? We are being presented with the opportunity to figure that out. And I think that I'm not trying to minimize the event, right? I'm also don't want to participate in aggrandizing it because people die. People die every day. People die every day in numbers that outnumber, sorry for the redundancy there, but that outstrip, outpace the death tolls of COVID-19 every day. Now, the reason where we've gone around about this whole thing and where the conspiracy theory lies, let's not worry about that. Yes, there are conspiracies. There are people conspiring to do things we won't like, that we won't want to support. Killing them is not the answer. Lots of people out there that are aware of these nefarious plans, that's what they want to do. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The system wants you to stock up and prep forever for that bloody revolution. And if you ever get around to actually participating in it, the system's ready because you just paid them to be ready. The real revolution is inside. The real revolution is healing. The real revolution is transcending the mental paradigms that everyone is working with in a gentle, healing way, not in a rip them off each other, hurts, we get mad and start bitch smacking each other for having done it kind of way. The real revolution is in your mind, behind your mind, before your mind. And it'll only ever happen when each of us stops and takes the time to go there and find it. That stillness at the center of our being, where divinity itself says, I am. As always, friends, I thank you for tuning in and listening. As always, I beg you for forgiveness if I sound redundant. And as always, if you're new and you're like, what the fuck? I humbly invite you to check out the rest of my episodes. Hop around, jump on titles that seem appealing to you, or start from the beginning and catch all the way back up, whichever way you want. And also, friends, stay tuned. I've been teasing this for days, and I know I haven't actually done it yet, but progress is actually rolling, and motivation is actually piling up. I'm going to be sort of representing nuggets of the show in a tighter, more compact, hopefully more approachable format. But I'm going to still keep doing the podcast like a live radio talk show also. So stay tuned. This new version of this new repackaging of my ramblings will hopefully be tight and interesting and also visually appealing because it's going to be animated. All right, that's the teaser for that bit for today. I'm also getting really serious about a different little side project. So stay tuned for announcements about that. And I'm also hopefully going to be releasing a few new short writings over on the Wattpad. At any rate, that's just me trying to stay on top of my own self-promotion. Namaste, friends. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. I have been your eccentric, erratic, spirally rambly, fractally unfolding robot from the future host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. And I humbly invite you to stay tuned as more episodes will be dropping soon. And if you haven't yet, go find me on the social media. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. Just type in @Mr. Zeppo, no period, just MRZEPPO. Should be able to find me on all the platforms. And if you see me somewhere where it's not really me, let me know, because I think there's been some copycatting going on. Because I know what platforms I'm on, and if you see me on a weirdo platform you haven't heard me talk about, someone bring it up. And then also, if there are cool social media platforms that I don't know about yet, let me know. Anyways, peace out. May peace, love, and grooviness blossom in your heart. Stay strong, folks.